and welcome to Miss James reading to you out loud since we're all stuck at home. Today I'm going to be reading out of the Smart Aleck's Guide to American History, which you have scanned into Google Classroom. We won't be reading the whole thing today. We'll be doing this in about 10-minute chunks. So today, please turn in your books to the beginning of chapter 5, which is page 132. Incidentally, also the first page that you have scanned in. It says chapter 5, the Gilded Age or Screw the Poor. Okay, does anybody know what the word to gild means as a verb? No? Surprise, surprise. Okay, to gild means to take a cheap material, sometimes metal, sometimes just plastic, something like that, and cover it with a very thin layer of gold paint or something else that would make it look like it was made out of a more expensive material. It doesn't change the fact that it's still made out of a piece of cheap material. So this is kind of like, I don't know, the general idea of Pinterest is you take something kind of cheap and trash and you turn it into something that looks like it's valuable or something that's valuable to you. So that's the meaning of just the generic term to gild something. When we talk about the Gilded Age, we're talking about a whole period in history where things looked like they were really, really good. Like there was a small handful of extremely rich people who were living these incredible, luxurious lives. But then for most of the people in the world, their lives were not great. So if you just look at a very small part of that American history, it looks like it was a fantastic time and place to live in the United States. But if you scratch the surface, like if you scratch just a little bit of that gold paint off, what you find underneath is the cheaper, less worthy material. What you find in the United States is that if you look beyond that handful of extremely rich people who had everything, most of the people's lives were pretty miserable during this time period. So it's called the Gilded Age, which is kind of appropriate as you're going to see. What is the chief end of man? To get rich. In what way? Dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must. Following the crappy years of the Civil War, America burst forth into the Gilded Age. It was an age when everything seemed shiny and beautiful and full of promise for a great future, as long as you were rich and appropriately corrupt. Otherwise, your life probably sucked as much as ever. More, if anything, except that you'd be a lot less likely to spend all day marching, which is a reference to the Civil War chapter before this. America very rapidly became an industrial empire and one of the major powers in the world. New factories, mills, and oil fields were changing the face of the country. Lots of inventions like light bulbs, movies, and telephones were starting to appear. But behind the scenes, the labor involved in building many of these things was deadly, and the pay was crap. Thousands of workers died, many of them immigrants, women, blacks, or others who had no real voice or power in the country. The rich got richer in this era. Lots richer. But the life of the poor, which had never been a picnic, got harder and harder. The West was being tamed, meaning that it wasn't really the Wild West anymore, but an awful lot of Native Americans got killed in the process. If presidents such as Garfield, Arthur, McKinley, Harrison, and Cleveland sound obscure, it's because they are. Everyone knew who was really in charge of the country in these days, and it wasn't the president. It was a handful of rich jerks. Many of these rich jerks were about as corrupt as a person can possibly be, and they knew full well that they could do anything they wanted and step on anyone they wanted without fear of getting in trouble. The laissez-faire, meaning let them do whatever the heck they want, attitude that governments in America and England took towards big business in this era led to an age of great advancement and a bright future for many at the expense of great misery for others. Laissez-faire is a French term for if you're looking at it in the book there, you'll need to see how it's spelled because in French they leave out the last letters of most words. The form of government in which people, especially big business owners, get to do whatever they want. The idea is that the government kind of stays hands-off in terms of regulating businesses and telling them what they can and cannot do, which is great in some respects. It allows business owners to do innovative, new, creative things. The downside is it also allows them to do things like pollute as much as they want with no regulation. So there are up and down sides to laissez-faire government. but it's one of those terms that people expect you to know and understand and have heard of before. Custer's last stand. It was during this era that the great American frontier began to vanish as the Wild West was won. Lacking a war to keep it occupied, the Army busied itself with killing every Native American it could find. About 300,000 Native Americans were left in the West at this point, having been kicked all over the country for years, and the U.S. government spent 25 years in a war against them. Tribes were sent to one reservation or another, under the authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which of course was pretty openly corrupt. Reservations, for the record, was usually a polite way of saying death camps. Reservations were poorly supplied, on poor land, with little access to luxuries like medical care. But if someone found gold or some valuable use for the land the reservation was on, the tribes were ordered to go someplace else. Sometimes they hadn't been moved in the first place, so much as slaughtered. George Armstrong Custer had become a general at the age of 23 during the Civil War. When the war was over, he embarked on a career of tromping around the country, hassling Native Americans, and, most likely, waiting to turn 35 so he could run for president. Having found out that there was gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the government ordered the Cheyenne and Sioux tribes who were living there to get lost. Instead, they decided to fight back. When Custer and his men attacked, they were outnumbered by something like 10 to 1. Only one soldier survived the battle, and it wasn't Custer or even a person. It was a horse. This battle, known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, was the last victory the Native Americans would have over the Army. Americans were furious when they heard about this. After all, the newspapers made it look like Custer and his heroic, innocent men had been savagely wiped out by the horrible Indians. Everywhere cries were heard to kill every Indian left, and about half of the U.S. Army was sent to do exactly that. All over, natives were either killed or pushed onto reservations. No one knows how many Native Americans were in the country before the Europeans arrived. Some estimates say it was about 4 million, other estimates go as high as 18 million. In 1910, there were about 250,000 left. There's really nothing funny we can say about this, but we can still make fun of cowboys, so proceed to the next section. Cowboys. Around the same time that people were thinking of Native Americans as dangerous, bloodthirsty maniacs, they were also starting to romanticize cowboys. And by this usage of romanticize, what we mean is to make them sound better than they really are, to only remember the good things about them, or to even make up good things about them to remember. We've used the word romanticize to talk about Al Capone and how people kind of, like he's clearly a terrible guy, but people kind of remember him fondly now that they've managed to forget about or ignore all the bad things that he was doing. Of all the smelly people in American history, and if we've taught you anything, it's probably that there were plenty of these, the real cowboys may have been just about the smelliest. The cowboys shown in books of the day and in movies and TV shows of the 20th century had very little in common with the real ones. During the late 19th century, cowboys played a major role in what was starting to be called the Wild West. Most of the stories told about the Wild West, the shootouts at high noon, the outlaws, and the battles between cowboys and Indians, were entirely untrue. In fact, there weren't all that many cowboys to begin with. Even in their heyday, cowboys were outnumbered by farmers about 1,000 to 1. Cowboys' lives consisted mainly of driving cattle across the prairie, and their idea of a good time was probably stopping off in a small town for a night of drinking. They probably did smell terrible, and were hugely unpopular before they started to become a part of the new mythology America was creating for itself. Shootouts between cowboys and outlaws were actually uncommon. In fact, there's no evidence that there was ever a single shootout on a main street at high noon anywhere in the West. Dodge City became famous for its shootouts, but in its worst year, there were only 5 shootings. And that thing in movies where the person who draws his gun and fires first shoots the other guy and wins, that's just nonsense. In reality, according to Wyatt Earp, a Wild West big shot who ended up living in Hollywood and hanging out with several early cowboy movie stars, the person who survived the shootout was, invariably, the one who took the time to aim. But towns like Tombstone, Dodge City, and Deadwood became famous for the dramatic shootouts for one major reason. To attract more settlers and tourists, the locals went along with the stories written about them in dime novels. To this day, these towns all have booming gift shops. And people ate the stories up. Robbers and murderers like Jesse James and Billy the Kid came to be viewed as Robin Hood type characters. Guys like Buffalo Bill Cody, who ran a popular Wild West show, even ended up writing books about themselves. And Cody's wife cheerfully admitted that most of his stories were complete hooey. Cody stuck to his story that he'd been wounded 137 times in fights with Indians, but after his death, his wife said that at least 136 of these wounds were made up. It's easy to imagine why these stories might seem so attractive. America was a new country with relatively few heroes or myths of its own. It had been settled by white people anyway, for only about 250 years. And as we've seen from the first chapters of this book, most of the 150 first years were so dull that history books just skip right on over them. The best story about the Pilgrims involved them heroically eating a meal. And people were still sharply divided on which figures from the previous 100 years, including the Civil War and the dull years before it, were heroes, and which ones were villains. These mythical cowboys had no real political leanings. They simply fought for courage, honor, and rugged individualism, 3 qualities that most Americans could agree were good. And sitting at home reading a dime novel about shootouts between cowboys and outlaws, you couldn't tell what the prairie smelled like. But it's easy enough to imagine if you think about it. Cattle ranches would have been filled with, well, a whole bunch of bull. Okay, that'll be our section for today. We'll join in tomorrow or possibly the next day whenever I assign it with the rest of this section. Thank you!